welcome you to the opening ceremony of the International Interdisciplinary Conference entitled Borders, Literary, Cultural and Political Dialogues, organized by the Department of English Language and Literature of the School of Philosophy of the University of Athens and the Hellenic Association for the Study of English. The welcome address, on behalf of the Rector of the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens, Professor Siasos, will be read by the head of the Department of English Language and Literature of the University of Athens, Professor Efterpi Mitsi. An address by Professor Efterpi Mitsi will follow. Thank you.
I will read the rector's address. Unfortunately, he has just called me. He had an important a problem at the hospital, and he couldn't be with us today. He truly regrets that. So I will read his address. Your Excellency, Ambassador of the Republic of Cyprus to Greece, Mr. Stavros Avgoustidis, Honorable Head of the Department of English Language and Literature of the University of Athens, Professor Efterpi Mitsi, Honorable President of the Hellenic Association for the Study of English, Associate Professor of the Department of English Language and Literature, Mrs. Vasiliki Markidou, Honorable Secretary of the Hellenic Association for the Study of English, Assistant Professor of the Department of English Language and Literature, Mr. Angelos Evangelou, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the opening ceremony of the International Interdisciplinary Conference entitled Borders, Literary, Cultural and Political Dialogues, organized by the Department of English Language and Literature of the School of Philosophy at the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens, in collaboration with the Hellenic Association for the Study of English. Today's conference centers on a concept of profound historical, political, and cultural significance. Borders are not merely geographical lines separating sovereign states and societies. They're also places of contact, transition, and interaction, and often sites where identities, ideas, and cultural experiences are negotiated and redefined. In the current setting, the humanities and social sciences are called upon to contribute meaningfully to our understanding of these complex phenomena. The Department of English Language and Literature at the University of Athens has consistently served this academic mission, fostering research, encouraging international scholarly dialogue, and building strong connections between the humanities and the pressing social issues of our time. Alongside my congratulations on the department's exemplary achievements to date, I would also like to express my personal thanks to the Dean of the School of Philosophy at the University of Athens, Professor Dimitrios Drousos, for his steadfast support of initiatives and activities that promote research, academic exchange, and the international outlook of the school. I would also like to warmly congratulate the chair of the Department of English Language and Literature, the distinguished Professor Efterpi Mitsi, on this outstanding initiative. My sincere thanks to His Excellency, the Ambassador of the Republic of Cyprus to Greece, Mr. Stavros Avgoustidis, for honoring today's ceremony with his presence. I would further like to thank the chair of the Hellenic Association for the Study of English, Professor Vasiliki Markidou, as well as the association secretary, Professor Angelos Evangelou, for their assistance with the organizational and academic aspects of the conference. Last but not least, we extend our thanks to Professor Athina Athanasiou of the Department of Social Anthropology at Pantheon University of Social and Political Sciences, who will shortly deliver the keynote address. I am confident that this conference will draw attention to some of the most urgent questions of the present day, while opening up new perspectives and encouraging fruitful reflection. Finally, I would once again like to congratulate the faculty and staff of the Department of English Language and Literature for their outstanding teaching and research, and for establishing the department as one of the most sought-after academic destinations at the University of Athens. We, in the university leadership, are immensely proud of the department's remarkable progress and of all its initiatives, which we are pleased to support. Thank you very much. Your Excellency, Ambassador of the Republic of Cyprus to Greece, dear President of the Hellenic Association for the Study of English, dear Secretary of the Hellenic Association for the Study of English, dear keynote speaker, Professor Athanasiou, dear colleagues, students, and esteemed guests, on behalf of the Department of English Language and Literature, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the International Interdisciplinary Conference, Borders, Literary, Cultural, and Political Dialogues. The Dean of the School of Philosophy, Professor Drousos, sends his regrets that he couldn't be here with us today and has asked me to convey his warmest welcome. Marked by the profound upheavals of 2 world wars, the dismantling of colonial empires, and dramatic geopolitical shifts, the previous century saw a global tightening of national borders. Today, as contemporary warfare and insecurity resurface, we must interrogate the historical, political, and social forces that continue to shape these borders. This conference invites us to look beyond the border as a tool of separation, reframing it as a complex site of encounter, negotiation, and transformation. This historical landscape resonates with the story of our own Department of English Language and Literature at the University of Athens. As the oldest and largest department of foreign language and literature in Greece, with almost 300 new students every year, our history is closely tied to the post-war contingencies and the emerging world order of the mid-20th century. Although professors of English language and literature had been teaching at the School of Philosophy of the University of Athens since the 1930s, including distinguished poets and authors, the department was founded in 1951 in the immediate aftermath of World War II, reflecting not only the ascendancy of English as a global language, but also the desire to open channels of communication and to participate actively in global dialogues. In this sense, our department's history mirrors the very themes of the conference. Borders shift, but so do the communities that inhabit and interpret them. Universities, though rooted as national institutions, and this university, of course, was created just after Greece became an independent nation and was part of its national project, they embody this dynamic at their best. They form transnational and trans-ethnic communities, spaces where ideas circulate freely, where debate is welcomed, and where dialogue becomes a shared responsibility. Events like this one reaffirm our commitment to intellectual openness and remind us that scholarship itself transcends borders. I thank each of you for bringing your voice, your research, and your perspective to this conference. I especially thank my dear colleagues, Professor Markidou and Professor Evangeliou, who have worked very hard to make this conference possible. May the dialogues that begin here today foster new insights, new collaborations, and a renewed sense of shared purpose. I wish you all an inspiring and productive conference. Thank you.
Address by His Excellency, the Ambassador of the Republic of Cyprus to Greece, Mr. Stavros Avgoustidis.
Dear Chair, let me start by extending my best wishes to the Rector. Dear Chair, dear Head of the Department of English Language and Literature, dear President of the Hellenic Association for the Study of English, dear professors, distinguished faculty members, esteemed scholars and participants, dear students, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It is a great honor and pleasure to address this international interdisciplinary conference. The theme of the conference is both timely and profoundly significant. As it was mentioned by the Rector, borders are far more than lines drawn on maps. They are spaces where identities are shaped, contested, and reimagined. They may divide territories and peoples, but they may also serve as points of encounter, exchange, and of course, transformation. For the people of Cyprus, borders are not merely theoretical constructs. They are part of our lived experience. More than 5 decades, as you all may know, after the Turkish invasion of 1974, Cyprus remains under occupation and divided. The green line that runs through Nicosia stands as a visible reminder of the enduring consequences of aggression and the violation of international law, as well of our unwavering commitment to freedom, to the reunification of our homeland, and to the return of our people to their occupied towns and villages, within the framework, of course, of a just and lasting settlement of the Cyprus problem. Yet Cyprus is also a place where borders have historically functioned as bridges. Situated at the crossroads of Europe, Asia, and Africa, our island has for millennia been a meeting point of civilizations, languages, religions, and cultures. This rich heritage demonstrates that borders can become spaces of dialogue and coexistence rather than barriers of exclusion. Literature and the arts possess the unique capacity to transcend boundaries that politics often struggles to overcome. Through storytelling, poetry, and artistic expression, we come to recognize our shared humanity and to understand perspectives beyond our own. This is, in essence, what I often refer to as the diplomacy of culture. By promoting culture, education, and intellectual exchange, we build mutual understanding, foster trust, and create conditions conducive to peace and cooperation. At a time when our world is confronted by war, forced displacement, geopolitical uncertainty, and deep social divisions, the interdisciplinary approach of this conference is more important than ever. By bringing together literary studies, cultural analysis, and political reflection, you offer a valuable framework for examining the complexities of borders in all their dimensions. The close cooperation between Greece and Cyprus in the fields of education, culture, and research remains a cornerstone of our enduring and fraternal relationship. Our universities and academic communities play a vital role in nurturing this shared intellectual and cultural space. I would like to warmly congratulate the organizers on this outstanding initiative and wish every success to the conference. I'm confident that your discussions will generate fresh insights and contribute meaningfully to our understanding of borders, not only as lines of separation, but also as spaces and bridges of encounter, creativity, and hope. Thank you very much.
Address by the President of the Hellenic Association for the Study of English, Associate Professor of the Department of English Language and Literature of the University of Athens, Mrs. Vasiliki Markidou.
Dear Excellency, Ambassador of the Republic of Cyprus and Greece, dear Head of the Department of English Language and Literature, Professor Evi Mitsi, dear Professor Athina Thanasiou, dear delegates, dear colleagues, and dear students. In my capacity as the President of the Hellenic Association for the Study of English, board member of the European Society for the Study of English, and member of the organizing committee, together with my dear colleague, Professor Angelos Evangelou, I'm honored to welcome you, such a diverse group of scholars, activists, and artists, to the International Interdisciplinary Conference, Borders, Literary, Cultural, and Political Dialogues. This conference is organized by the Department of English Language and Literature, School of Philosophy, National and Kapodistrian University of Athens, and the Hellenic Association for the Study of English, and it is taking place in this very historical central building of the University of Athens, right where we are today and tomorrow, and in the library of the law school just steps away on the next 2 days. We are gathered here to explore new research, share innovative ideas, and engage in meaningful debates over the next 4 days. One of the conference's aims is to explore how we bridge not only geographical, but also disciplinary borders. Whether we view borders as lines on a map, limits of our disciplines, or cultural horizons, the concept of border is both urgently topical and rapidly evolving to a highly complex space that calls for reflection. Even more crucially so, we meet today at a critical juncture in history as we face great challenges ranging from wars to migration flows to climate change and displacement, to reinforced persecution, violence, and human rights violations. As such, the issue of borders is not only a critical topic of our time, but it also challenges us to reflect on how we define ourselves and engage with others, on how we rethink and define inclusion, identity, and sovereignty. The conference's program reflects its strong interdisciplinarity, encompassing, as it does, literary studies, the arts, cultural studies, philosophy, law, geopolitics, history, and social anthropology, and therefore promises rich intellectual exchanges regarding the concept of borders. Indeed, in the course of the next 4 days, we will reflect on a wide array of key critical and cultural border studies that address most urgent issues. Moreover, the conference's delegates are coming and this is really a great honor and delight, from no less than 29 different countries, from so many continents. And do allow me to read the countries out, because I think it immediately, reflects this wonderful diversity. Austria, Belgium, Canada, Cyprus, France, Germany, Greece, Hungary, Hong Kong, India, Italy, Japan, Jordan, Luxembourg, Malta, Mexico, Netherlands, Poland, Portugal, Romania, Saudi Arabia, Spain, Sweden, Thailand, Tunisia, Turkey, the UK, Ukraine, and the USA. And the next few days, this truly global and multicultural community will attempt to trace means and ways of overcoming barriers, fostering inclusivity, and building bridges rather than walls, as well as of developing resilient communities, meeting places, zones of dialogue, and threshold to new perspectives. Dear delegates, your insights are essential to making this a dynamic and productive event. Thank you for joining us in Athens to discuss all these complex and most urgent concerns. Let's make this meeting a great intellectual experience, and above all, a form of commitment to humanitarian standards and international cooperation. Once again, a very warm welcome to all of you. Thank you.
Address by the Secretary of the Hellenic Association for the Study of English, Assistant Professor of the Department of English Language and Literature of the University of Athens, Mr. Angelos Evangelou.
Your Excellency, Ambassador of Cyprus to Greece, dear Professor Mitsi, dear colleagues, dear students, dear guests, good morning. I too extend to all of you a warm welcome to our conference, and it is an absolute pleasure to see so many of you here today from near and far. We do not take your presence for granted, and we are truly honored to see how this call has led to this felicitous and inspiring gathering of scholars, diplomats, community researchers, activists, practitioners, and artists working on borders. The truly interdisciplinary character of the conference makes us proud, and we have all the speakers to thank for this impressive and touching response. I would like to begin by expressing my gratitude to the board of HASE, the Hellenic Association for the Study of English, for proposing the topic of borders for this conference and for inviting me to co-organize it with the president of HASE, my dear colleague Vasiliki Markidou. Vasya, it's been a long and at times challenging venture, but our unfailingly excellent collaboration is something I will cherish for a long time. The care with which you have handled everything, from small to big, has been inspiring, and I thank you for being such a fantastic partner. My sincere thanks also go to HASE and the Department of English Language and Literature of the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens for their continued support. My personal connection to Cyprus as a divided home and my research interests in literary and cinematographic representations of borders, inspired by the impressively growing scholarship in the fields of cultural and critical border studies and border theory, of which some of the leading figures are here today, make this for me a very special event. For us, it was important that the concept of border be examined critically, that the concept's multiple dimensions, connotations, and manifestations are investigated in an effort not only to release or confirm its geopolitical manifestations, but to appreciate borders' complex and pervasive presence in our culture and in the very way we understand place and space, home, the nation, ourselves, and the others. In other words, the conference contributes to the visibility of a large number of geopolitical borders and their long, complex, and contested histories that demand to be addressed, especially today, especially in today's world, the world to which we all here also partake. In the span of these 4 days, the conference has one more ambition, and this is to create a truly open space in which we all rethink our own borders too, our ideological boundaries and our differences, different ways of seeing things, a space which can foster an honest, transparent, and rigorous exchange of ideas, of agreements and disagreements, responsibly and respectfully. I close with the words of my mentor, friend, and eminent Cypriot poet and writer, Stefanos Stefanidis, who, thinking about home and by extension the nation, he cautions. We create boundaries from its boundless meaning, bind it in and bind it out, make space a place, a room of one's own. And then, if you bind it in too tightly, it becomes inhospitable, inert, and stultifying, or violently exclusionist for the privilege of one group, whether it be ethnic or some other kind. And its original sensual mystery of home slips away, and you feel out of place, or a prisoner in your own place, if you have not already been violently displaced from that prison. Boundaries become alive where something begins, not where something stops. When a horizon of expectation opens, a dynamic unfolding, the gift of hospitality we give or receive by letting go. I wish us all a great conference. Thank you.
The keynote lecture will be delivered by the professor of the Department of Social Anthropology of the Pantheon University of Social and Political Sciences, Mrs. Athina Athanasiou, entitled Rewriting the Border, Reflections on the Right to Narrate. The keynote lecture will be moderated by Associate Professor of the Department of English, Language and Literature of the University of Athens, Mrs. Mina Karavanda.
Καλημέρα, καλώς ορίσατε στην Αθήνα, στο Πανεπιστήμιο Αθηνών. Good morning and welcome. I'm grateful to my dear colleagues and friends, Vasiliki Markidou, Professors Vasiliki Markidou and Angelos Evangelou, for trusting me with this task to introduce someone whose work has inspired me all these years as a feminist, post-colonial critic, and thinker. But before I say the few things that I have to say in the time allotted about Professor Athina Athanasiou's work, I'd like to express my gratitude to my colleagues for inviting me to this conference that I know they organize with a lot of love and care. We often think that love and care are not parts of the labor that we perform in the humanities, and that's why often the humanities is treated as an outcast, but I think that this work that we do here with love and care engages the political in significant ways that are not reducible and accountable to politics, which is business as usual. But instead we try to persevere as thinkers, as scholars, as academics, as teachers, and most importantly, as human beings against all odds. And it is on this note of perseverance that I'd like to turn to Professor Athina Athanasiou's work that traverses social anthropology, philosophy, gender studies, and political theory, offering vital insights into the ways borders are not lived, not only as territorial demarcations, but as embodied and affected regimes that shape mobility, citizenship, vulnerability, and resistance. Her broader body of work, including Life at the Limit, essays on gender, body, and biopolitics, Crisis as a State of Exception, and her many other essays that intervene on feminism, biopolitics, and dissent in contemporary Greece and abroad and beyond, has consistently challenged us to rethink the relations between embodiment, power, resistance, and democratic responsibility and possibility. Drawing on feminist, queer, deconstruction, and post-colonial thought, Athanasiou investigates how political identities are performed and contested in public space through protest, mourning, witnessing, assembly, and acts of embodied resistance. Themes such as vulnerability, performativity, memory, biopolitics, and most importantly, agonistic democracy recur throughout her work, always with attention to how marginalized and dispossessed subjects negotiate conditions of exclusion while imagining and performing alternative modalities of coexistence and political community. A central third that I find most important in her work and her scholarship is the question of dispossession that we associate often with something that is negative, except for Athina, this is a space and a body filled with potentiality. In her widely discussed, co-authored with Judith Butler work, Dispossession, the Performative and the Political, Athanasiou reconceptualizes dispossession not solely as a loss or deprivation, but also as a constitutive condition of relationality and political emergence. The book examines how subjects are formed through conditions of dependency, exposure, and vulnerability, while also asking how collective resistance can arise from shared precarity in contexts that are marked by austerity, migration, occupation, and state violence. Her work has been, especially for a lot of us scholars in Greece, but also Europe, and in our classes where we teach her work, at least I do consistently, has been especially important for understanding the contemporary politics of borders in moments of economic crisis, forced displacement, and intensified nationalism. And what is important about Athina is that she has also published widely in beautiful academic Greek, not restricting her publications only to English. In her book, Agonistic Mourning, Political Dissidence and the Women in Black, Athanasiou explores mourning not as a process that resolves loss into reconciliation, but as an open and conflictual practice that can interrupt nationalist policies and closures and sustain democratic contestation. Her work asks whose lives become publicly grievable and whose deaths remain unrecognized. A question of profound urgency now, as ever, in our year especially, that is shaped by border deaths, racialized violence, war, and displacement. Through the activism of the women in Black during and after the war in Yugoslavia, Athanasiou shows how practices of public mourning evoking and echoing here an older figure she has also preoccupied herself with, Antigone, challenged not only in territorial borders, but also symbolic and political boundaries based on ethnicity, citizenship, and belonging. Their silent vigils resist the logic of nationalist separation by mourning victims across enemy lines, exposing borders as systems that regulate visibility, memory, and humanity itself. In all the business that we do in the humanities, thinking about the other, living and thinking with this other that is maybe someone we're not intimate with or someone we don't wish to be intimate with, is the work that is most important for us right here, right now. For Athanasiou, such practices are profoundly political in the sense that they remain unaccountable to the contemporary desire of sovereignty for building up walls and fences, and instead, and here I borrow her words, challenge conventional divisions between the affective and the political, between the political and the performative, as well as between body and language. At a time when politics has been reduced to business and the destruction of human life is accounted as collateral damage at best, also they have to die. It is a particular privilege to welcome Professor Athina Athanasiou as keynote speaker for this conference on borders. A critical work that focuses on the question of the political as emerging through dissidence and dissent and not through compliance and quiet agreement, and that focuses and is indispensable for thinking through the intertwined questions of displacement, grievability, resistance, and the contested politics of living together in the present moment. So please join me in welcoming Athina Athanasiou to the podium.
Αυτό το χρησιμοποιώ με... εντάξει, οκ. Ωραία. Νομίζω το έχω. Εντάξει. Ευχαριστώ. I'm very pleased and honored to be with all of you today in the context of this conference. I thank the Hellenic Association for the Study of English and the Department of English Language and Literature for making this event possible. My warmest thanks to colleagues Angelos Evangelou and Vasiliki Markidou for convening this conference with such care and love, and for inviting me to deliver this talk. It is particularly touching and meaningful for me that my dear colleague and friend, Mina Karavanda, is chairing this session. Mina, thank you so much for this moving introduction, which I don't deserve. But coming from you, I really, really appreciate it, and thank you for your inspiring work and friendship. In what follows, I hope to share a reflection on what is at stake in the question of borders, or borders as question, at this boundary moment marked by colonial brutality, neoliberal governmentality, and escalating authoritarianisms, including racist and anti-gender aggression. A boundary moment that perhaps requires us to ask how to critically account for the conditions of this devastating present in the face of repression of criticism and criminalization of solidarity. In this light, I ask how a critical reconfiguration of the apparatus of borders might indicate an opening of the present to what must be otherwise, countering the structural and epistemic effects of coloniality, systemic inequality, and institutionalized racism. What articulations of subjectivities, narratives, and affective economies keep the possibility for such a critical reconfiguration open at this moment of foreclosed possibilities for critique and dissent? Along these lines, I seek to foreground how the present, in the form of what Laurent Berland has called crisis ordinariness, compels critical thought to pose again the question of the border in its incalculable fault lines animated through pursuits of critique, resistance, and solidarity. I would like to draw attention in this regard to how the banalized necropolitics that marks the order of settler colonialism, military interventions, anti-immigration policies, and racializing border securitization produces authoritative narrations of the world while foreclosing critical and transformative ones. I'm interested in how the border becomes an occasion, a passage, as it were, for recounting the demand to narrate impossible stories as a way to challenge the authorized matrices of speakability, unspeakability, and memorability, immemorability implicit in colonial imaginaries of bordering and partitioning. How might a narrative draw its possibility from that which renders it impossible then? To probe the possibility of narrativizing the border otherwise in the ongoing aftermath of dispossession and genocide, let me turn to reclaimed texts and textures of counter-narratives that haunt the ordinariness of the present and are haunted by a question that Palestinian author and poet Mahmoud Darwish asked: what can poetry say in a time of catastrophe? Okay. The first part is named The Right to Narrate. I have 3 parts, so that I warn you a little bit here. The Right to Narrate. British-Palestinian writer Isabella Hamad's book, Recognizing the Stranger, on Palestine and Narrative, is based on the Edward Said Memorial Lecture she delivered in September 2023 at Columbia University. At the university where months after the lecture, students who had set up encampments to protest the genocide in Gaza were arrested, persecuted, and expelled. Hamad delivered the lecture just 9 days before the events of October 7. If it was 9 days later, she recounted, Columbia probably wouldn't have let me give that speech. Written in the midst of the political present, the book begins in medias res, from the middle of things, that is, from a critical narrative point, as the author explains, and at the same time in the thick of it. Hamad seeks to speak from within the heart of narratives, without the comforts of linearity and closure, unfolding the present as persistently haunted by voices and narratives that have been previously silenced and yet have spoken about occupation, confinement, exile, and rebellion. Haunted by the restless question, where to begin? The grammar of the historical present tense becomes the lens through which the author asks what is required of us, when even if belatedly, at this moment of genocide, to articulate and demand what remains to come, a liberated future for Palestine. In Judith Butler's reflection on the motif of in medias res, narrations always arrive belatedly, haunted by what cannot be conveyed through neat and definitive accounts. They write, my narrative begins in medias res, when many things have already taken place to make me and my story in language possible. and it means that my story always arrives late. Along these lines, the narrative technique of in medias res articulates how the ghostly ruins of displaced histories make themselves disquietingly known and extend into the present as a possibility of disrupting the linear colonial temporality. Hamad's book is crafted from the material of recognition scenes as haunted narratives, which the author asks us to read through their unsettling strangeness. We are thrown in the midst of such moments of recognition with the task to allow their haunting ontological power to unsettle and transform us. Avery Gordon has explored how haunting is about an affective realization of unacknowledged oppressions and repressed histories. Being haunted makes us aware of omissions and ellipses that nonetheless linger in the present, thus drawing us into the possibility of what she calls transformative recognition. And I'm going to dwell on this notion later. Hamad reflects on a conversation with an Israeli former soldier in hiding she met in Galilee. He was a soldier stationed at the Gaza fence with the order to shoot in the leg anyone crossing the boundary. After encountering a Palestinian man approaching the Gaza border fence, entirely naked and holding a photograph of a child, he didn't follow his orders to shoot. Instead, he put down his gun and fled his post. Hamad finishes her narration of the deserter's story, and this is where the story takes a critical turn, really, quoting BDS movement co-founder Omar Barghouti. How many Palestinians need to die for one soldier to have their epiphany? Barghouti's gripping rhetorical question in its layers of sad resignation and defiance marks the ambivalent violence of recognition as unrelentingly implicated in the operations of the imperial power entailed in Western empathy, whereby privileged outsiders realize themselves through suddenly discovering the ongoing condition of Palestinian dispensability. The moral catharsis of the colonizers and the Western onlookers, Hamad asserts, is intricately entangled with the dispossession of Palestinians. The colonial and Western will to truth remains haunted by the question of how many, in Barghouti's question, which I'm going to repeat, how many Palestinians need to die for one soldier to have their epiphany. It remains, the colonial and Western will to truth, that is, remains haunted by the countless unmournable losses of lives rendered unlivable by the calculus of settler colonialism. In the story that Hamad narrates, the humanity of the Palestinian walking steadily towards the Gaza border is not a given for the Israeli soldiers, but a site of contested recognizability that depends on the conditions of possibility in which the scene of recognition takes place by differentially allocating the human. What is at stake here is how the production of the recognizably human body at the limit of life is implicated in those pre-existing and prevailing norms of recognition as well as misrecognition. Significantly, in the story of the deserting soldier, the scene of striving for recognition takes place at the border and in the face of ongoing colonial elimination of lives. At the border, the Palestinian is posited as fundamentally unrecognizable and is required to appeal for recognizability as human in order to render his life legible and viable, even for a moment. It is on account of the border as una herida abierta, open wound, in Gloria Anzaldua's memorable text, that those dehumanizing terms of recognizability and livability are sustained. Through this perspective, critically rethinking and speaking to the violence of the border from the vantage point of the blockade of Gaza and the occupied Palestinian territories requires moving beyond the neat narrative of a boundary line as a static and linear barrier separating sovereign entities, an imaginary inherited by a Eurocentric modern history of the nation-state, toward an understanding of walling as a settler colonial structure and strategy of enclosure that produces pervasive lived forms of dispossession. In Ahmed Kabel's words, walls are meant to separate and confine, but the grammar of separation can also be tactical. Walls also purport to define, divide, and dispossess. Those architectural mutilations are frontiers of territorial accumulation by dispossession. They constitute borders that partition and blockade. They're also ontocidal. Walls, checkpoints, and fences are likewise technologies of colonizing Palestinian time, the waiting, detention, interdiction, and trenching temporal apartheid. And in an essay titled, What is a Border?, Etienne Balibar has addressed the world-configuring function that borders perform in their polysemy, heterogeneity, and fictive violence. Implicated in shifting regimes of dispossession, domination, and exploitation, these arrangements articulate deeply heterogeneous and conflicted global geographies organized by colonial and imperialist expansion and the capitalist nation-state. And finally, as Eyal Weizman reminds us regarding the walls running through the occupied Palestinian territories in Israel, their pervasive operation exceeds the function of territorial demarcation and includes a multitude of elastic, temporary, and elusive formations. Aside from their function of managing, restricting, or eliminating the movement of Palestinians, as well as their access to medical and food supplies, Israeli border structures, ranging from concrete separation walls to checkpoints, blockades, and watchtowers, also operate as apparatuses of othering along colonial and racial hierarchies, reducing Palestinians to dehumanized, disposable bodies. What insurgent forms of bearing witness, grieving, and storytelling would be required then to speak to the pervasive violence of these present-absent frontiers of the occupied territories? How to narrate the border differently as pervasively haunted by the elimination of the possibility of critical witnessing and storytelling? The liminal narrative that Hamad recounts draws attention to the uncanny body politic produced at the Gaza borderscape, where the subjugated body comes into play as a primary site of both redrawing and challenging colonial boundaries. In its vulnerable but also defiant plea for acknowledgement, the marked body on the move appears to embody the conditions under which the border serves as a mechanism that relies on a politics of living death. The temporary survivor is doomed to a struggle for recognition by providing evidence of his destitution. A photograph as a remainder and reminder of loss and disrememberment, an articulation of a memory that survives the very impossibility of representation and witnessing. The scene of the Palestinian holding a photograph of a child as if to validate his humanity and finitude by documenting his unrecognizable love or ungrievable loss as real, recalls the words of literary critic Mark Nikanyan in relation to the Armenian catastrophe. We relentlessly need to prove our own death. Testimonies are documents of the witness's death. And yet, that is not the whole story. This is not just a scene of subjection, not even just a scene about the production of the border as a tool to prescribe who may live and who must die. At stake in this plea for reciprocity and proximity was also an embodying of a Palestine beyond borders in defiance of the necropolitical present of walls, fences, and checkpoints. Stripped of his humanity, subjected to the colonial gaze, and yet courageously reclaiming an unauthorized and unbounded humanness in the making and in motion, the naked Palestinian acts along and across those borders and boundaries. He exercises a right that is not available to him, the right to move, and at the same time, the right to narrate the human story improperly and survive this transgression. Given over to the violence of the border and yet refusing his objectified status, he embodies a performative contradiction, one that lies in coming out as human in spite of and in opposition to the colonially constituted powers of derealization. In Butler's words again, this is how the human comes into being again and again as that which we have yet to know. Ultimately, hauntedness becomes a means to recognize the human avowing its contingent and unknowable forms. It becomes a way of address that eludes its appropriation into the logics of recognition. In the disorienting recognition scene that took place at the militarized border fence in Gaza, a Palestinian refuses to remain inscribed within the established boundaries of the settler colonial schemes of appearance and recognition. Exercising sumud, the Palestinian cultural value and political strategy of steadfast endurance and defiance despite the odds, he articulates the premises of what an intelligible body is and who has the right to appear as such. He exceeds his capture by the border system of recognition. Not quite present and not quite absent, he rather makes himself recognizable ontologically in Jacques Derrida's terms, that is, in ways that register the demand for justice. At the same time, the border itself, as a mechanism that regulates the limits of recognition, is disjoined by this present yet absent appearance, seeking to hold open the side of acknowledgement, to hold onto the wound of belonging. Hamad draws on this scene to recast the question of recognition, calling for a shift in attention from the authorized epiphany as self-recognition of Western onlookers to the disremembered histories of Palestinian suffering and resistance that do not find a place in dominant narratives. She thus offers a view of recognition that remains responsive to those suppressed narratives of border transgression. She induces us to reflect how the boundaries of the human are drawn by means of leaving no room for other narrations, other losses. To do so, she places the right to narrate at center stage, making it actively involved in border struggles for bodies that matter. The production of the human through the subjugation of the other that is at stake in colonial processes of bordering border making and borderization goes hand in hand with a deeply uneven distribution of what counts as a revelatory moment and who bears the burden of its narration. She writes, and yet the pressure is again on Palestinians to tell the human story that will educate and enlighten others, and so allow for the conversion of the repentant Westerner, who might then descend onto the stage, if not as a hero, then perhaps as some kind of deus ex machina. What does it mean for a repentant Westerner to come to recognition, even if partial and belated, of what one has uncannily known all along? More significantly for our purposes here, how does recognition as a potentially critical concept require questioning the limits of what we know or what we think we know? How can the recognition of erased, other losses truly descender the position of knowing subjects, especially those who bask at the center of the story and have never had to fight for the right to narrate? How would a critical reframing of recognition as re-awareness of others involve the responsibility of finding a place from which to speak back to the pervasive powers of denial, erasure, and complicity in the present without lateness? The issue at hand here is the simultaneous impossibility and obscenity at the heart of attempts to testify to the humanity of the stranger, in Hamad's terms, when the survivor is left to expose and prove her open wound over and over again, and the witness to testify to their own dehumanization, in Nicanian's words. Reframing Walter Benjamin's assertion that there is no document of culture which is not at the same time a document of barbarism, Nicanian argues that catastrophic testimony, his phrase, catastrophic testimony, inevitably becomes a document of culture. In other words, it is inherently inscribed in the suppressive frames of representation and appropriation involved in the disownment of memory. For those positioned on the disowned side of history and side of the border, facts do not speak for themselves. In this light, recognition, if any, is confronted with strangeness and the critical task of unlearning authorized factuality and its reliance upon denegation. Challenging the epistemic violence embedded in gestures of epiphany and frameworks of recognition implies reclaiming an invalidated story against all odds, pushing the boundaries of what can be said beyond the logic of verification. Therefore, the framework of recognition needs to be troubled and radically re-articulated in its expansive possibility of critical desubjectivation brought about by the unchosen proximity of the other. In that sense, it needs to be reconstructed in its possibility of responsiveness. I quote Judith Butler here, when our willingness to become undone constitutes our chance of becoming human. End of quote. Becoming available to become undone involves reworking the very defining conditions by which recognition takes place in medias res, made possible or foreclosed by matrices of recognizability that are already historically constituted and active before the recognition scene itself is set up. Becoming available to become undone involves constantly undoing and redoing the boundaries of the possible in becoming human, which means bearing witness to one's own foreignness in the language of recognition. Profoundly implicated in the misappropriation of the witness, recognition is embedded in the very order of self-affirming colonial subjugation that posits the colonized as always awaiting recognition, always having to prove their humanity, always seeking permission to live, and, in Edward Said's words, permission to narrate. However, recognition is bound to be partial and incomplete, haunted by claims of narrating otherwise, and so critical recognition, if such a thing can ever exist, might need to reframe the narrative of who qualifies as a narrating subject and what can be narrated. Conveying a commitment to account for, okay, I'm going to skip this, sorry, I'm being aware of the time here. We're half through. An exploration of what Hamad described as the narrative shape of the Palestinian struggle. The book, Recognizing the Stranger, was written partly before and partly after October 2023. The text of the lecture is followed by a lengthy afterword, which makes up about a third of the book, written after Israel's attack amidst the devastating escalation of violence in Gaza. The more reflective tone of the lecture is followed or complemented by the urgent and harrowing testimony of the ongoingness of settler colonialism from the Nakba of 1948 to the current genocide, and indeed under conditions that criminalize solidarity with Palestine. In the afterword, Hamad is confronted with the loss of the language through which one could convey the impossibility of narrating the loss. She reaches for a different narrative form to come after words, but also afterwards. She reaches for a narrative that can do justice to the tense of the present, opening it to a future to come. At one point, she recounts a girl's rescue from the rubble in Gaza, who asks those carrying her out on a stretcher if they are taking her to the cemetery, to finally realize that she is alive while surrounded by death. Hamad's point is not to grasp the disaster, but rather to write back by coming to grips with the constraints of available narrative frames for grasping it. The flow of history, she writes, always exceeds the narrative frames we impose on it. Inspired by Said's reflections on contrapuntal reading and the dispossessed right to self-narration, Hamad insists on the transformative power of reading to acknowledge the languages, voices, testimonies, and tonalities that have been violently eliminated but still flicker like ghosts on the narrative horizon. She turns to moments of knowing again, moments of revelation of some hidden meaning, accompanied by the realization that perhaps it was already in some obscure way known. Everything we thought we knew has been turned on its head, she writes, and yet it all makes sense, end of quote. Contemplating the concept of recognition as a literary device in Greek tragedy, denoting the startling transition from ignorance to knowledge, but also breaking with an account of recognition as self-realization. She works with a literary way of recognizing what it means to be pushed out of one's center, or the central position one believes they occupy in the world, when the other appears on the horizon, not as a predetermined category, but as a transformative possibility. Possibility of being thrown off center, and perhaps possibility of being together. In recognizing the stranger, the acts of recognition and reading are closely interrelated. potentially de-subjectifying, to invoke Foucault here, non-redemptive, fundamentally undecidable, and alive to the inevitability of misreading and misrecognition. In this sense, both anagnosi, reading, and anagnorisi, recognition, can be limit experiences in such a way that they can challenge the limits and boundaries of conditions of possibility that undergird ethical, political, cultural, and literary life. Anagnorisis and anagnosis, recognition and reading, become intertwined in ways that convey that there is no fixed and stable meaning to read or recognize. Only provisional critical engagements that may open a text up to new readings and recognition up to new demands for justice. The question then becomes how a critical reading experience can open pathways for a critical experience of recognition. A recognition different from itself, challenging simultaneously narrational injustice and the uneven distribution of recognizability. In Hamad's text, recognition is not a self-affirming flash of insight for the moral catharsis of privileged observers, but becomes a form of unsettling relational reading through an awareness of others. Recognition becomes a way of reading again and reading with others. What is at stake here is a crucial shift from recognition as a normalizing practice of self-realization in colonial capitalist hegemony to a counter-hegemonic account of recognition as a transformative process of urgently unlearning and unknowing the unbearable injustice of subjugation as it erupts in devastating presence of colonial rule. How does a narrative intertwine with the plots and the ruins of history when it is already too late? How does narrative time respond to critical turning points, given that these are recognized as such only in retrospect? And how might recognition as renewed awareness of others propel us out of the habitual registers of collective complicity and shallow sentimentality? Such questions become for the author fragments of reflection on what it means to write and read in the wake and from a place of exile. At the end of her lecture, Hamad describes exile as agony, but also as ethical position. Exile articulates a critical, unhomed framework for unwavering engagement and vigilance. To be an exile is not only to remain always a bit of a stranger. Significantly, it is also to resist the resolution of the narrative, keeping the story alive, but also open-ended, staying in the middle of the narrative, reading while resisting the urge for neat closures, recognizing the limits of recognition, and above all, sitting within the agony. Let's now see what implications this has for the work of mourning. Hamad draws our attention to recognition as a means of resisting the resolution of the narrative, of not feeling at home, that is, with an awareness of others. In this context, she enables a reflection of what kind of redistribution of political, ethical, and affective resources is required so that Palestinian grief can take place even if it remains unresolved. Arguably, mourning is only possible insofar as it remains unresolved. Arguably, sorry, I'm going to repeat that. I missed my line here. Arguably, mourning is only possible insofar as it remains unresolved, that is, beyond closure. This aporia at the heart of mourning, which Derrida has explored, bears significant ethico-political connotations. The act of mourning the death of those who have been abjected in their life and death exceeds the bounds of an individual act of mourning. It necessitates and it opens up to the possibility of disrupting the necropolitical boundaries of grievability in all their racial, colonial, national, class, and gendered implications. In this way, the politics of improper and dissident mourning, allowing the dead others to haunt the present, brings forward an incalculable temporality of a new and intensified awareness, which might open up spaces of contestation and solidarity into the body politic, as well as the body of politics. In this sense, agonistic mourning in its impossibility, with a hyphen, impossibility, conditions the possibility for a politics and a body politic to come. Hamad captures such a displaced and restless mourning under settler colonial occupation, one that defies the scripts of resolution and redemption. I'm going to give you a second to read that, a couple of seconds. The present onslaught leaves no space for mourning, since mourning requires an afterwards, but only for repeated shock and the ebb and flow of grief. We who are not there, witnessing from afar, in what ways are we mutilating ourselves when we dissociate it to cope? To remain human at this juncture is to remain in agony. Let us remain there. It is the most honest place from which to speak. In the wake of the genocide in Gaza, but also in the ongoing depletion of Palestinian lives since 1948, mourning remains chronically incomplete and unresolved, illegible and obfuscated, caught in an inconsolable present of endless ungrievability that is not just contingent upon, but in fact, structurally central to the logic of occupation. While the colonizers weaponize their own memory as the only truly human experience, the colonized are denied the right to mourn. They are subjected not only to conditions of dispensability and slow death, but also ultimately to a constant dispossession of their mourning. And yet, grieving Palestinian losses as an openness to the possibility of impossible mourning remains a horizon for anti-imperial resistance and self-determination with no closure. Accountable to a constant interrogation of existing conditions of possibility, this impossible mourning to come is first and foremost a ontological mode of resistance to the systematic erasure of Palestinian life. It is a world-making claim for a radical redistribution of the relational and narrational resources of loss and grief. In a text titled, "Can the Palestinian Mourn?" Abdel-Jawad Omar argues that Palestinian resistances fight for the right to mourn. And he asks in what ways that shape the conditions for what Omar calls a collective state of perpetual deferral of mourning. What conceptual and narrational textures of the right to mourn can be devised then to speak back to the dispossession, to this relentless situation of dispossession in defiance of archival violence? How can one grieve at the crossroads of long-standing, lingering loss and ongoing disrememberment? In the Mahmoud Darwish lecture titled "Standing on the Rubble" that Isabella Hamad delivered last February at Brown University, she addressed the power of commemorating the martyr, which renders such funerals, her words, a site of communal defiance and revolt. Hamad's book, written at a boundary moment and a critical narrative turning point, which leaves no room for mourning, asks how storytelling, standing on the rubble, can sustain resistance against erasure. To remain human at this juncture is to remain in agony, she writes. This uncomfortable and unsettling affective position is the most honest place from which we can speak. Remaining human in this sense is already formed and constrained by the agony at the heart of the question, what remains of human after the operation of disrememberment upon which this designation is predicated. It requires narratives and actions that resist the injunction to look away, allowing for interruptive liminal moments of encountering the loss of loss, to lead, perhaps, to transformative decolonial social imaginaries, practices, and subjectivities. Avowing the uncertainties and the anxieties of engagement, it calls for critical methods of keeping the story alive in all its limitations and impossibilities. However, the outcome of such critical engagement remains fundamentally undetermined. If learning moments of Western spectators necessitate the normalized exposure of the colonized to the deathly violence of occupation, as Hamad alerts, then at stake is the uncomfortable politicizing potentiality of unlearning. The border where the recognition scene in Hamad's narrative occurs, which is a liminal space intimately connected with what she, following Said, refers to as recognizing the stranger, that border then works as a reminder of the incommensurable complexities at the heart of narrative, recognition, and solidarities in these times of Western silence, erasure with regards to Palestine, when even the words Palestine and genocide are rendered unspeakable. Coming with an awareness of such limitations and impossibilities, the commitment to keep the story alive through unsettling encounters and openings. I'm closing to the end here. Recalls Saidiya Hartman's method of critical fabulation, that is, using creative narrative to respond to the limits of the colonial authorized history and to reimagine other possible lives. Counteracting the archival erasure of Black women yearning for freedom at the beginning of the 20th century, Hartman's narrative foregrounds their world-making rebellion as a mode of reckoning with the agony and the hope of the question, can I live? Ultimately, the commitment to keep the story alive in the face of uncertainty about when freedom will come and when life will be possible again resounds in the haunting words of Refat Al-Harir, the Palestinian scholar and poet, co-editor of Gaza Unsilenced and editor of Gaza Writes Back, who was killed by an Israeli strike on December 6, 2023. I quote, "If I must die, you must live. Tell my story. If I must die, let it bring hope. Let it be a story." In his poem Counterpoint, written in 2005 as a tribute to his close friend Edward Said, Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish conveys Said's testament to the possibility of keeping the story alive in the face of deathly occupation and oppression. He also said, "If I die before you, my will is the impossible." I asked, "Is the impossible far off?" He said, "A generation away." I asked, "And if I die before you?" He said, "I shall pay my condolences to Mount Galilee and write, the aesthetic is to reach poise. And now, don't forget, if I die before you, my will is the impossible." Seeking the impossible through poetry that is daring to imagine beyond the bounds of the archive is an open-ended call, one that is attuned to Hartman's account of how both to tell an impossible story and to amplify the impossibility of its telling. This wager involves fighting the exclusions and elisions in the archival record and at the same time acknowledging the impossibility to fully recover and recuperate the past. This is about a constant and irreconcilable process of attending to the impossibility, both the futility and the hope, to create a space of mourning where it is prohibited, to fabricate a witness to a death not much noticed. Perhaps the task here is not to settle for a definition of mourning as lamenting for the sanctioned premises of continuity, but to reposition it in terms of dislodging such naturalized temporal conditions of possibility that sustain the preservation of this world. Navigating the irreparable and irretrievable limits of narration in the face of the aporetic impossibility to mourn a long-standing death, a long-standing exposure to death, is about carrying out wake work as a form of incalculable responsibility against the limits of the possible and beyond the recognition systems enforced by the power of separation fences, walls, and checkpoints. In this regard, the poetic performativity of critical theory and stance, or critical theory as a stance, lies in the possibility of responding to what remains to be recovered from the ruins and can be reconstructed in a different way. As Isabella Hamad writes in Recognizing the Other on Palestine and Narrative, the grand liberatory visions of the progressive and anti-colonial movements of the past century seem to have been shattered. Yet, some are trying to build something out of these ruins, drawing on languages from here and there to keep our movements alive. Along these lines, what is at stake in summoning disregarded and dissident narratives in intersecting contexts of situated knowledge production, such as the political collective, the street, the university, the aesthetic, the literary, is keeping open the possibility of a refigured future that breaks out of the conditions of impossible life under which Palestinians are forced to live. The critical force of these collective moments is imbued with a polysemous affective state of anxiety, rage, grief, but also solidarity, care, imagination, and the pressured contingencies of hope as a fugitive, contrapuntal response to the lived experience of the impossible. For the organization Queers in Palestine, the conditions of being unwarded by colonial violence become conditions of possibility for resisting erasure. Language can no longer hold the weight of our suffering, our rage, our endless grief. While capitalism and colonialism's forces of death and destruction are wounding the world, we're still determined to deliver our voice, we're still moved by the force of life, and will always move with and towards it. In this sense, hope becomes a collective practice of imagining and building a future after the genocidal destruction of bodies, lands, and futures. Queers in Palestine, again, our bodies ache with exhaustion, our spirits bruised by the relentless weight of oppression. In this land stolen from us, where we live the genocide in our every moment, hope is a radical practice. This is a political engagement that simultaneously mourns and organizes. It encompasses constellations of brokenness, endurance, and responsiveness to account for ways of reclaiming the possibility whose conditions have been depleted. I have suggested here that to critically reflect about borders at this moment in history, a moment haunted by the ruins of Gaza, is to engage narratives, knowledges, and practices that work to undo the normalized cartographies of occupation, containment, and partition at the heart of the settler colonial present. This is about reckoning with the limits of available narrative frames and the loss of mourning, while persisting in remembering and sharing words and stories that forego accounting, but also that would otherwise remain unaccounted for. It is, after all, to attend to the opaque, lingering limit presences that have been disavowed by dominant conditions of possibility for witnessing and narrating, all the while preparing for different conditions of possibility. Such liminal presences persist in the present, making themselves known in ways that shift the entrenched boundaries of what can be known and what can be done. In Avery Gordon's words, the ghost demands your attention, the present wavers, something will happen. What will happen, of course, is not given in advance, but something must be done. I think this emergent state is also the critical analytic moment. I would like to conclude my remarks today with this critical moment. I would like to ask us all to stay with the trouble and the potentiality of this critical moment. From this perspective, then, reclaiming the constrained and precarious possibilities of anagnosis and anagnorisis, reading and recognition as modes of attentive relationality and critical responsibility in our times requires, I argue, the critical work of something must be done in all its fragility, incompletion, and unknowability. Thank you very much.
Σε ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ, Αθηνά. We thank you for practicing, embodying, and performing this critical analytic moment. I'm sure that the participants here have a lot of questions. I only would like to say that I appreciated how your focus on the textual did not rely on the sentimentalism of the photograph, and you invited us to visualize the words through poetic lines and critical lines. Often we are overwhelmed with photographs of disaster and pain, and then we easily forget about what it is that they register. So I thank you personally for that. This is time to turn to the audience, and there's also Konstantinos there. Would you like to ask a question, make a comment, share your thoughts? Please. Professor Christina Doku, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this beautiful and nuanced talk. While you were speaking, I was reminded of a scene from the Iliad where old Priam steals into Achilles' tent and they have this long conversation about what it means to be human in Greek and what it means to be human in Trojan, after which Achilles relents and allows Priam to take the body of his son and bury it with honor. It is the moment where the boundaries between Troy and Greece are broken, where the unbreachable walls, in a sense, are breached without any physical exchange of dramatic magnitude. I was wondering, do you think there can be such a moment between Israel and Palestine where there will be an understanding of common humanity and the capacity for mourning and burying our dead?
Thank you so much for sharing with us this wonderful thought and this daunting question. Let me start by sharing some reflection. I mean, again, you mentioned the human, and I think against the backdrop of this relentless dehumanization that goes on under the conditions of occupation in Palestine, it's important to remember that, sorry, I'm losing my voice here. Edward Said, whom I have mentioned a lot today, has suggested that humanism is the final resistance we have against the inhuman practices and injustices of occupation and apartheid and colonialism. Although I find this very powerful as a thought and as a hope, I'm not sure to what extent this can be mobilized politically, especially for the reasons that I have tried to explore here. I mean, Hamad, although she draws abundantly on Said's work, she has her own moment of revelation and moment of recognition, and she invites us all to try to have our own moments of recognition as moments of critical awareness. So Hamad registers her doubts about this precisely because she says that she's now realizing how the project of humanism is embedded in colonial thought. And she says, others have understood that earlier and faster than me, and it took me some time. So I think it's important to remember that humanism is a product of colonial modernity and racial capitalism. So the question here, and I'm coming to your important question, the question is, to what extent we can reclaim humanism as a device of criticizing colonial modernity and its dehumanizing implications. So we are inhabiting here a very an aporetic space, right? I mean, the question is how to reclaim humanism, which is always already infused with histories of dehumanization as a device of criticizing and dismantling colonial modernity. So I would say, paying tribute to Said in a way, to whose thought I'm critical at the same time, that we need here to think further about, and to draw on histories of colonial, decolonial thought, Black feminist thought, strands of thought which have tried to register the possibility of an anti-colonial humanism, a decolonized humanism, kind of a fugitive humanism, if we think of Fred Moten's work. So with this little, after this introductory note here, okay, the answer to your very, very important and daunting question is that I don't know. I can refer to scholarship that I admire and find very empowering in that respect. I remember, for example, I have in mind Judith Butler's work in their very important text, which is called, I believe, What Shall We Do Without Exile, where they talk about the way in which Edward Said and Darwish address the future, so the question of, what is to be done and what is going to be done. Butler explores a cohabiting future in Israel, Palestine, and it's interesting how they do that by deploying both Palestinian displacement and histories of diasporic Jewishness as a material to think in that direction. And of course, we know that Said, let me rephrase it, rather Butler, drawing on Said, challenges Zionism's focus on nation-state sovereignty, urging for a critique of Zionism rooted in the ethical, they underscore this, the ethical obligations of living together, right? So cohabitation is at stake here. My thought on this, because there's a real tension going on right now in critical Palestinian thought, right, regarding this question precisely. If I may recapitulate and sum up this tension, it's a tension between national liberation and a post-state horizon, right? So there's those who articulate this possibility of future in terms of national liberation, others who frame it as in a framework of a post-state horizon. And my thought on that is that the model of a two-state solution, let's say, has already revealed its limitations, especially after the Oslo Accords. I don't want to be very, start hearing as a political scientist here, but I have in mind the work, for example, of Abdel-Jawad Omar, who actually explicates this tension. To my mind, this tension between one state or two-state solution is a very, in a way, it's a very reductive way of framing this important question. I agree with Omar when he says that the future of Palestine and the future of the Palestinian political subject must arise from the ruins of Gaza as something which is now unthinkable to the colonial present, something that is not yet there, something that we not yet have the language for. And he says somewhere, unfortunately I don't have the quotation here, but he says that perhaps this is what is most frightening to our enemies. He says that the Palestinian is no longer asking to end their history, but to rewrite history. So we need an alternative, he says, an alternative imaginary. We need a more complex articulation beyond these available tools, one state, post-state, all that. And one must not trivialize the demand for a state, right? Don't get me wrong, it's very important, but I take very seriously Omar's goal that we may be approaching here, and we need to approach here, we need to think further here with a more complex articulation of a kind of non-sovereign sovereignty, a form of collective political life based on cohabitation, but not necessarily captured by a logics of, reconciliation, depoliticized, closure, disrememberment, and kind of, deferral of injustice in the name of being together. So being together needs to be and maintain its political force, its political performativity here. It requires justice to be done, right? So, this is important here. Sorry, that was a little too long, sorry. But it's a difficult question. And it requires collective thought, not just, for one person to, just one more.
Thank you, Athena. Professor Mabel Morania.
Thank you. I just wanted to say that from my perspective, the most important for me, for my interests, the most important movement here is when you go from the universal field of humanism into the particulars and the contingency of the political. Because if we stay at the level of humanism, we fall into a universalism that doesn't say much about the specifics of the problem, in this particular case, the Palestinian situation. Because after all, problems of recognition and all that are not specific to this specific conflict, but you can find that in civil wars, in any war, in national conflicts and movements of liberation, so it's a problem that has to do with, enmity and war itself is at the heart of war. But the important thing is to translate that universality, I would say, into the contingency of the political in Gaza. I think that is the important point here, because if not, we are exercising a type of critique or criticism that is falling into humanism like a commonplace that we can apply to any kind of situation. But I rather want to think about critique as interpellation. And I don't know what you think about that.
I'm not sure about the last part, critique as interpellation. That's because I'm not sure I heard it well. Okay, great. Okay, well, that's another very important question. Thank you for sharing this. I wish we had more time to think together about that, but my spontaneous reaction to that is first, the part of your question which has to do with the universality is very important here in this context, I think, especially if we rethink the question of the universal from the perspective, from the vantage point of those who have no place and no right to occupy a place in the universal, but nonetheless claim this right, nonetheless, exercise this right while embodying and performing a different universality. So there's always this question of, who's universal, whose universality, what kind of, which universality are we talking about? Because there is a strong performative force here. I would say performative force towards a critical universality, a critical and insurgent universality, which takes into consideration, as you said, the contingencies of the political. In a sense, I would say that this kind of insurgent universality must be prepared to redefine its own boundaries all the time. So the question is how to keep this horizon open and how to keep it as a contested domain. So this universality is one of these tricky, very complicated terms that, like recognition in a way, right? That in a way we don't afford to relinquish them so easily, especially because there are still there are subjects and collectives that claim their right to criticize these established, authorized realms of universality, of recognition, and so on and so forth. So in that respect, I think that the important question is, which rights and which perspectives are treated as universal, whose right to have rights, to recall Hannah Arendt, are treated as impossible or unintelligible, And I'm saying all that because, Edward Said was really somehow invested in this reclaiming of the universal. I'm not sure, and I'm critical of that, although I understand the performative importance of keeping a concept as a space of critique. So in a way, I mean, we need to keep it. We resist the urge to relinquish these problematic terms just because we need them as spaces of contestation. So in that respect, critique, your question about critique as interpellation, yeah, I'm not sure about that. It's a very complicated question. I'm not sure. What I can share with you is that critical thought, which is under attack, currently, is really one of the last refuges. Spaces that we have available to assemble and resist and at the same time embrace complexity, embrace aporia. Being in such an urgent present should not mean that we are ready to relinquish complexity and critical thought. I know that some people believe that, critical thought is a luxury. No, critical thought is the air we breathe, right? It really has to do with the way in which we can still find the reason, the stamina, the hope to pursue what is that we do. And I understand that this is a moment which is called anti-critique, the era of anti-critique, and critical thought in different versions, from decolonial thought to genderqueer theory. They are considered to be threatening, and they are banned, and they are so this I find a very, very alarming symptom of our neo-authoritarian times. Now, to my mind, critique is a way of resisting interpellation, although I understand that interpellation can be part of critique as well. I would like to hear more about, from you, because I'm not ready to say any more now. But thank you for your question. Very important.
Okay, one more question, final question, and then.
Thank you, Athena, again and again for ever being so inspiring. Just a small reminder of the rest of the story of Troia. When Priamos begged for the body of Hectorus, after his body was being completely violated in public sphere around the walls of Troia, that moment which you recalled as a moment, let's say, of kindness or of hope, was just the moment before the Greeks turned Troia to history, to a pile of rumbles. So the story continues. The story tells us that the moment you bow to the person who demands your land, what you're going to get back is the ruins of your land, is the dead people, of the dead corpses of your people, is what we witness for 3 years now in Gaza, and for how many, since 48, throughout Palestine. So I don't know if we still here, if we stand here at the moment of hope, what we're going to miss is the moment of genocide. And I'm pretty sure that the people in Palestine and in Gaza have read their story very well, and the story of Troya very well. And thank you for bringing this up, because it made a connection in my mind that this is why the Greek state and the Greek government is the most strategic partner of IDF and Israel in the area. They go way back in their understanding of how we treat people that beg for peace. Thank you in that sense.
Thank you. I agree with every word that you just said, Irini. Thank you so much. Let me just say a few words that last time I checked, it's a war crime to attack a humanitarian mission. And the attack on, I mean, according to the Rome Statute, right? And the attack on the Sumud flotilla is not just an act of international piracy. It's a reminder that Israel has been deploying its armed forces against the Palestinian solidarity movement in Europe and everywhere. And I think it's very important to remember the implication of Greek government. Israel's attack against the Sumud flotilla took place far from its own territory, as you know. It took place in international waters. It took place off the coast of Crete. It's probably useful to remember that only Spain among EU member states condemned this attack. So the Greek government is cooperating fully in Israel's criminal behavior. And of course, we have to remember that Israel's blockade of Gaza is totally, completely illegal. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you.
Athena, I know we've tired you, but can you hold on for one more question?
Sure.
Couple more
I thought that
questions?
was the...
Yeah, and
Okay.
we are done.
Sorry.
Okay, but yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for your impressive speech. I am a former associate professor of Volodymyr Dalin Eastern Ukrainian University, and now I am myself is a refugee researcher, research fellow in Politecnico di Torino and BTU Cottbus-Seftenberg. So my question is, as I research Ukrainian women in a course of Russian-Ukrainian war, my question is that I see the strong framework of memory in your research, in your view, and how can you would understand the horizontal voices, the voices of women narratives? Can they form the horizontal decolonial archives of memory, and how?
So, yeah, thank you for being here, and thank you for asking this question, for sharing this. I mean, my research now is, organized. This paper was organized around this, Palestinian occupation and apartheid. But I take your comment. It's the question of memory is very, very important. And of course, your question gave me the chance to say that I wish I had more time to expand on this question of memory, because there's so much interesting work coming from Palestinian voices right now on memory, and there's wonderful scholarship, activist work, research work. I have in mind, for example, Rana Barakat's work on memory and storytelling in Palestine. And it's a wonderful account in which she collects stories from family and community members. alongside the archival sources about a specific village, talking about the particular, someone talked about the particular before. So, I mean, I don't have much to say, but memory is a very contested terrain in times of war, of course, right? Because one thing that gets dispossessed in regimes of dispossession is the right to remember, the right to mourn, and the right to recount and narrativize, of course. I mean, that's why I focused on these more embodied and affective registers of colonialism here, and war, as you pointed out. Times of war are, times at which memory is weaponized, precisely because memory can be, weaponized by the sovereign, the colonizer, and then, the memories of the subaltern, whoever these are, under different conditions of war or colonialism, are completely, dispossessed and obfuscated and occluded. And we have to remember that this is a very interesting point that Anne Stoller makes when she explains her very important term, colonial aphasia. She says that this is not about knowing or unknowing. It's about particular strategies of occluding knowledge. So memory and knowledge becomes a contested realm. It is a power game. It is a contested terrain, and we see that all the time in contemporary contexts of war and injustice, which are unfortunately really everywhere. I mean, we live in a present which is infused by these injustices, which are at the same time injustices, narrational injustices, mnemonic injustices, affective, political, economic, and so on and so forth. So thank you for that. Yeah. Thank you once again. Thank you.
Thank you. And I've just been informed that the catering service is running a little bit late, a few minutes late because of a traffic jam, an accident that happened outside. One final question from Alexandra, one of our MA students who studied borders with Professor Vangelou, and they've been reading your work, Athina, and then we can all, end the session together.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much for your presentation and for naming what is happening right now as a genocide, not a war, because it is a genocide. And as a person who comes from the biggest supporter of Israel within Europe, Germany, they support Israel with weapons to no stop, basically. And finally, Judith Butler has been dragged through the mud, basically, in German media and German academia for standing with Palestine. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's better, because I didn't hear the previous sentence of yours. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, it's better. Thank you.
Exactly. And as of now, the slogan, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," is illegal in Germany, and Israel is the only other country where this slogan, let's say, is illegal. And now I wanted to ask you, how do you navigate, let's say, as an academic, a world kind of hegemony that wants you to do a certain kind of research? How do you resist that? How can you do research and be to some degree successful as within resistance, let's say?
Thank you. Yes, well, that's a great question. I mean, I'm not here to give anyone, who am I to offer guidelines, and we're just sharing ideas here. But certainly, this is one of the most appalling aspects of the present we're living in, right? I mean, we're talking about an institutionalized censorship against Palestine, against solidarity to Palestine, and this has been affecting our research, our whatever has remained from academic freedom. I don't even know what it is. I mean, it doesn't exist. It was already traumatized by neoliberal governmentality and the austerity politics and the closing down of departments of critical thinking, basically. Of course, gender theory, decolonial, post-colonial thinking, they're total pariahs. But certainly, this thing that we're witnessing here, the censorship, the institutionalized censorship of Palestine is appalling. And I do hope that the universities of the world, and I utter these words while feeling a little hopeless about that, but I certainly feel the urge to invite us all to be aware and alert and express our solidarity in any way we can in all different contexts, especially in the context of our universities. On the other side, we have to remember that, like all modes of resistance, resistance is layered, right? I mean, some people are more exposed to the violence of censorship and retribution. And I understand, I mean, I have personally had this experience, co-supervising a dissertation in Austria, and this person has been expelled for posting a Free Palestine thing somewhere in Instagram, I believe. I don't know because I don't have social media, but it seems like it was Instagram, and it's unbelievable. And we are left, to sign letters and to file complaints, which is important. We have to do it all the time, although it may seem, a continuous exercise in futility. We have to show up. We have to show up, we have to express, we have to convey our solidarity, and we have to exercise our right of free speech, because if we don't exercise it, although we know that it's already constrained and undermined, all this is true, we know that, but we nevertheless exercise this right in solidarity with those of us who exercise rights which are not available to them. Thank you.
Thank you all for your questions and your attentiveness and care. I'm sure this is the opening of many conversations and discussions to take place not only inside the rooms, but also outside. And Athena, thank you so much. Thank you very, very much. And there is lunch, you tell them.
So there is lunch. Is there lunch?
Soon to be.
Soon to be. So lunch is in the foyer of Alkis Argeriades Amphitheatre. Once you come down the stairs, you go right, and it's in the yard, in the backyard.